He wanted to use Iraq as a demonstration of American power, because after all, if the United States could go to Iraq, eliminate the regime, not claim the oil, but assert control essentially over the oil, that would be a lesson to the entire world. It would intimidate any possible rival power.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Always at War, the only podcast I know of that is attempting to answer the question, why is the U.S. always, constantly, literally, never-endingly at war? We are brought to you by the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, a think tank dedicated to building a world where peace is the norm and war is the exception. I am Courtney Rawlings, here as always with my bestie and boss, Alex Jordan. Alex Jordan, how you doing?
I'm great. We should really be unpacking the power dynamics between you and I, manager and managee, more on the show.
Yeah, that's what it's kind of about. It's really a therapy session for me. Sure, we're going to be talking about the death of Dick Cheney, but most importantly, we're talking about the life of me.
First things first, folks.
It's the Middle East, and stuff happens in the Middle East. You know it. You've covered it for years. But you cannot, I don't think you can make a case that the world would be better off today if Saddam Hussein were still in power.
So no regrets about Iraq?
I think we made exactly the right decisions.
So yeah, it's friend of the pod, Dick Cheney, has passed away.
Rip. Yeah, he has passed away. I was genuinely caught off guard. I actually learned about it because you sent me a video this morning of Mandami learning that Dick Cheney was dead and someone trying to do a gotcha.
When did that happen?
Just earlier this morning.
So I was like, oh, that's weird that this person's just saying Dick Cheney's dead. And then I Googled it and I was like, oh, okay, sorry, you're way ahead of me news-wise. I also learned alongside Mandami, it's another thing we have in common. Both famous, both learned Dick Cheney died around the same time.
Both very charismatic, both future
charismatic, smiling, love
major American cities. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the thing that caught me about that video is, of course, the parallel to the Trump learning about Ruth Bader Ginsburg dying.
Yes, I actually saw that in the comments.
She just died? Wow. I didn't know that. You're telling me now for the first time.
So I, since learning, thanks for that news update, Alex, have been, doing what I do best, scrolling. And I've noticed a lot, dare I say every politician, taking to X, formerly Twitter, including our favorite politician, Nancy Pelosi, lauding the dearly departed Dick Cheney as a true patriot. How are we defining patriot these days?
Politicians, when you go into public service, you leave a legacy of what you did in office and what you did in the name of Americans, best interests. And so my plea would be for judging people who take on incredible power by what they choose to do with that power.
Yeah.
And I think Cheney's record is pretty clear, from being the architect of the Iraq War to overseeing extrajudicial torture program to helping remove constraints from the White House's ability to wage war unilaterally. Cheney should be viewed as the person who was responsible for all of those policies and what those policies entailed, and whether or not he was being cynical or he believed that he was bettering America, to me seems irrelevant to talking about his legacy. And I
think we talk about this a lot, Alex. I am wary of this notion that we can separate what may or may not be motivating someone within their head from their actions. I actually only care about your actions. Whatever delusions or opinions or vibrations you have in your head are completely, that have nothing to do with anything in the lived world. Because guess what, Dick Cheney? You killed thousands, millions. You spent billions. You took from taxpayers. Jim actually, with our colleague Kelly Vlahos, wrote a really great kind of quick turnaround response to Cheney's death this morning. And I thought this paragraph was especially kind of summed up his quote unquote patriotism really well. Quote, there will be many obituaries written for Dick Cheney. All will be scarred with his role in the Iraq War. For a time, he was a very, very powerful man, and then he went away to retire and help his grandchildren. How many hundreds of thousands of American families were unable to do the same, plagued by death, disease, mental injuries, sterility, divorce, addiction, suicide, because of a war that he so relentlessly pushed, but should have never been. Is that comms approved for Nancy Pelosi to publish?
Yeah, I don't think that you're getting that statement from many members on the Hill, but I think it's spot on. It's these people take on an enormous amount of power at the heights of U.S. government, and they should be judged for what they choose to do with that power and the effects of that power. And for Dick Cheney, it was, like that paragraph mentions, like untold death and destruction among American service members and their families and their communities, millions of people dead in the 9/11 wars, tens of millions more displaced. It is such a representative figure of U.S. foreign policy in every aspect, including the lack of accountability, that I can't help but think at this moment. I don't know if we haven't had a chance to talk about this, but like, how important is it to, for example, Antony Blinken, who was, Biden's Secretary of State, who helped, defend and arm Israel's genocide. How reassuring is it to him to see Dick Cheney, architect of like endless war crimes, extrajudicial torture, remembered pretty fondly by American political elite, even those who viciously opposed him? I would imagine this is also part of the fraternity of Washington. Part of why people don't decry him as a war criminal is because they don't want people to turn around and say that about them when they are dead, right?
Well, on that note, Alex, I think we should turn to our conversation with Jim. We're going to talk to Jim about Dick Cheney, but also neoconservatism. Is Dick Cheney a neoconservative? And kind of where does his death kind of leave us today?
As for the reaction of the Arab street, the Middle East expert, Professor Fuad Ajami, predicts that after liberation, the streets in Basra and Baghdad are sure to erupt in joy, and the same way throngs in Kabul greeted the Americans. The reality is that these times bring not only dangers, but also opportunities.
All right, folks, we're excited to be joined today by Jim Lobe, who is a contributing editor to Responsible Statecraft, the online publication of the Quincy Institute. Jim is a wonderful fellow. He served as chief of the Washington Bureau of the Inter Press Service for a number of years. He's also really, really knowledgeable when it comes to the history of the neoconservative movement and its influence on U.S. foreign policy. He directed lowblog.com. Thanks, Jim, for joining us.
Sure. My pleasure.
Jim, my good friend, I was wondering if you could just get us started by talking to us about how you got into foreign policy. Just kind of set the stage of what piqued your interest.
Let's see. I mean, Vietnam War was going on. I was in college for that, and then in law school. In law school, I was in Berkeley. And, there was the Christmas bombing campaign that Henry Kissinger put together.
Would you very briefly explain what that was?
The Vietnam War.
Well, no, the Christmas bombing campaign.
Well, essentially, the U.S. and North Vietnam had kind of agreed on a dignified exit of the United States over a period of time from the war. But in order to show American macho, Nixon and Kissinger initiated a bombing campaign that lasted about a month during the Christmas period. It was exceeding in almost every respect. And I remember feeling for the first time kind of catatonic. I think it was my first year of law school, and I didn't really want to see anybody for a while. That affected me a lot. Then in '73, and I was still in Berkeley, came the overthrow of Salvador Allende, the president of Chile, and the installation of what became a particularly vicious dictatorship under Augusto Pinochet. And I think all of that had a big influence on me. So
I'm like struck by your description of feeling catatonic during the Christmas bombing campaign, because I feel like that's a feeling that a lot of people who watch foreign policy today can recognize, that feeling of like helplessness as the Gaza genocide played out. But I also feel like it's a feeling I felt very much, and it started my interest in foreign policy during the Iraq War, seeing that play out and feeling helpless. Do you remember sort of that feeling around the Christmas bombing?
yeah, I mean, I had already done a lot of stuff related to the anti-war movement, particularly in college at Williams College in Massachusetts. I mean, like I was quite active at the time, and but I think for some reason the Christmas bombing affected me much more deeply. I think my engagement previously was more intellectual, even though it was active. But for some reason, Christmas bombing really, really did it to me.
Do you think it was like the pointlessness of it? Like it had no relevance whatsoever to.
Well, we didn't know exactly.
Yeah.
At that time, we didn't know exactly what the war aims were, and the agreement itself was still secret. So we didn't know that they were bombing for no apparent reason other than to show American power. Because, as I understand it, the terms of the Paris Peace Accord, which is what the eventual agreement was called, really didn't change after the bombing. So to me, especially in retrospect, it looked just, it was terrible. And as I said, affected me quite deeply. So I said, well, what am I doing in law school anyway?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned kind of like an effective emotional response that kind of spurred you into thinking about and engaging with foreign policy, because so many of the figures that I am familiar with you studying, the neoconservative movement in particular, are so markedly unemotional and lacking the empathy that you seem to have been drawn into foreign policy for the first place by.
Yeah, maybe. I think neoconservatives can get quite emotional, but they try to be very analytical, and they put forward, that image. I mean, I think
What gets them emotional?
Devotion. Well, I think their devotion to Israel, which really distinguishes neoconservatives from other hawks in American foreign policy. I think their devotion to Israel is very sincere and very deep.
Do you think it's sincere? That's so interesting. I guess I tend to hear it as effective, right?
I think that it's rationalized by their belief that somehow Israel and the U.S. are both morally exceptional, and their destinies are tied together. I think that's one way they deal with it. They deal with that issue. But I mean, I meant sincere in the sense that they really are devoted to what they believe in, which is strong, peace through strength, strong military power, American exceptionalism, Israeli exceptionalism. They're sincere in those respects when they express them. But I think when they talk about democracy and human rights, it's not true for all self-described neoconservatives, but I would argue that at least the hardline neoconservatives, people like Richard Pearl, Michael Ledeen, a lot of their funders are, I believe, quite cynical about human rights and democracy. In fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski once said, in answer to a question that I raised, that when neoconservatives talk about democracy, what they really mean is destabilization.
That's well said. Speaking of destabilization, it's an interesting day to have you on the podcast because I don't know if you've heard, but Dick Cheney passed away late last night, I think it was, of complications with pneumonia at age 84. I, for one, was shocked that he was 84, as I thought he was 84 about 30 years ago, but here we are. I also have heard you earlier today, around the office, et cetera, saying that you do not consider Dick Cheney a neoconservative. I guess this is all to say, how are you holding up with the news? How does he fit into kind of your picture of studying and thinking about foreign policy? And kind of how do we start talking about such a complicated figure?
Well, I think Cheney has been dead to me for some time. But I suspect that's true of a lot of people. Yeah, I don't believe he's a neoconservative.
Why not?
He's because I don't think he has any particular affection for Israel in the way that most neoconservatives, in fact, I think all neoconservatives do. As I say, I think that's what distinguishes neoconservatives from the much broader category of primicists or hawks or hardliners or however you want to describe them. Just as John Bolton has always insisted he's never been a neoconservative. And he's right. He comes from a completely different tradition in American foreign policy. But
so what tradition does
conservatives and aggressive nationalists, or sometimes I've referred to them as Machtpolitikers, meaning the politics of might and strength. They've cooperated for a very long time, dating back to the mid-'70s, when they were both very instrumental in derailing Henry Kissinger's détente strategy.
And Dick Cheney was a part of that, correct?
Yes, he was chief of staff. He was Ford's chief of staff. And Rumsfeld, later the two of them reunited in the first Bush administration. The second Bush administration. They worked very, very closely together in pursuing an anti-Soviet strategy, which was, quite detailed and very effective because they effectively undid or destroyed that which Kissinger had been working very hard to create, which was a détente with the Soviet Union. And they succeeded.
Now, why would somebody? Well, I guess there's two paired questions. So, if Cheney shouldn't be understood as neoconservative, could you help trace his lineage of what made him think and behave the way he did ideologically? And then why would someone with that intellectual lineage oppose détente during the Cold War?
Well, anti-communist and believing that the Soviet Union was an imperialist power and was a serious threat to the United States and its interests and its allies. Someone very committed to NATO as an instrument of containing Soviet power, and very committed to making things difficult for the Soviet Union. That has a fairly long pedigree dating back to the end of World War II. And, he was quite right-wing, and there was a right-wing, I don't know what you would call it, a right-wing tendency that dates back to the Bolshevik Revolution of enormous fear of communism, and Cheney, fell into that milieu, into that worldview.
guess one thing that I'm confused about, because it's very clear as you've laid out, what the neoconservatives are fueled by, their interests. And sure, Dick Cheney is maybe fueled by this kind of anti-communist interest, right, which is part of his issue with the detente with Soviet Union, probably his interest in a continued war with Vietnam. But what propels him, other than this anti-communist sentiment that clearly gets us from the 1970s, 1980s to the 2000s, where communism is really no longer a threat? And yet I think of him as kind of like a poster child for a kind of conservatism, not necessarily associated with anti-communism, but with pro-war. I don't know how else to put it, like a very hawkish sentiment. And how did we get from anti-communism to just unending conflict?
I don't think he intended it as unending conflict. In 2001, I think he swallowed what Wolfowitz and Pearl and the American Enterprise Institute and the Project for the New American Century was selling, which is, we can do this. They're going to greet us with candy and for sweets and flowers, and it'll be great because we'll have an ally in the very middle, the most strategic part of the Middle East, and we can destabilize Syria from there, and that would be easy too. I mean, I think he really believed in the idea of military power, and he certainly believed in American primacy. You have to remember, in the early 90s, after the Gulf War, he had Paul Wolfowitz, who was then he was at that time Secretary of Defense. Wolfowitz was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And he asked Wolfowitz to put together the defense planning guidance for 1992-93, which is long-term planning and long-term strategizing. And Wolfowitz and a coterie, a number of other people. I mean, Wolfowitz was kind of in charge of the document, but there were a number of people who actually wrote the document. And that document called for American domination of Eurasia, and called, among other things, for using whatever means would be necessary to make sure that no peer power or potential rival, whether it was Russia, whether it was China, whether it was the European Union, that nobody could be in a position of major military influence in the Eurasian continent compared to that of the United States. The United States had to be the power on which international peace and security would ultimately rest, and we should be able to act unilaterally and militarily whenever and wherever we wished. I mean, that was what there were other great quotes from that document, a draft of which leaked to the Washington Post, as a result of which it was to some extent toned down in its final form, but not really. But that document said that that U.S. intervention, military intervention, that is, throughout the world, would be a, quote, permanent fixture of the future, unquote. And Cheney defended that document. That was his document, and that's what he believed. And that's why I kind of refer to them as Machtpolitikers. They believe in military might.
I think there's something to the strategy document. Like, what it sounds like, Jim, is that Dick Cheney, helped commission a document about global military strategy. I think it was leaked to the Times in '92 or whatever, before it was not meant for public consumption. But I mean, is it fair to say, like, he helped, or he commissioned the writing of this Bible of primacy in the Cold War era that Democrats and Republicans are still like kneeling at the altar of, right? Like, that he wrote this book that still very much defines what U.S. foreign policy is today.
When that document was leaked, the headline reaction on the other side came from none other than Joe Biden. And he was then, I believe, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And his reaction was, this is Pax America, and I want nothing to do with it. So, I mean, Cheney represents a distinct, as I put it, Machtpolitik position in American foreign policy thought. Liberal interventionists like Biden have, I think, a different view of foreign policy that may not be as primacist, but I do think that there is a distinction. For example, Cheney believed in the unilateral use of American military power. Most liberal interventionists whom I know and who I generally disagree with because they're interventionists, but most of them are just much more comfortable acting in a multilateral coalition.
Sure.
And they
but the unilateral nature
for UN, authority to engage in whatever it is they're going to do. That there's a huge difference between those two worlds. They may in a bit merge, especially when the liberal interventionists start intervening, because the facts on the ground may be, ultimately have the same facts. Yes, Hillary Clinton voted in favor of the war, but Kennedy did not. Robert Byrd did not. There were many who spoke out against it, including the former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore. It's not that, in fact, Democrats were split. It wasn't an overwhelming majority of Democrats. And you have to remember what the polls were looking like at the time. I mean, the propaganda issuing from the White House, amplified by things like PNAC and the neoconservatives, who were very, very effective operators, as was Cheney. I mean, I should stress, Cheney as a bureaucrat was a genius. And the two of them worked together to gin up, the war, and the American public believed them.
Will you talk a little bit about, for example, the aluminum tubes with Judith Miller and the ways that Cheney's office himself helped manufacture the story behind why the invasion needed to happen, and then held up that media coverage as separate evidence of the need to launch an invasion of Iraq?
I mean, it was a very effective political propaganda campaign that began with, well, let me back up a little bit. The neoconservatives had long had Iraq in their sights because of their preoccupation with guaranteeing the security of Israel. There was a paper that was written, which you may have heard of, called The Clean Break, Securing the Realm.
No,
and
what's that?
The Clean Break paper was put together by 6 people, all of them neoconservatives. It was written by a guy named David Wormser, very neoconservative, very devoted to Israel, as was his wife, who was Israeli and participated in putting this paper together. And the paper was designed to be given to none other than Benjamin Netanyahu, who had just been elected Prime Minister of Israel. This paper basically said, Oslo is a disaster for Israel because it will lead to the creation of a Palestinian state, which is not tolerable. So the clean break referred to getting out of Oslo, and securing the realm referred to Israeli control of as much Palestinian or occupied territory as could be done. And that paper theorized that if the Israelis could destabilize Syria, the easiest way to do so would be first to take Iraq. The key presented in this paper was get Iraq, and then things will start falling into line, and ultimately you won't have to have a Palestinian state. You can get out of Oslo and the Oslo process. And one of the participants in this group was Richard Pearl. And Richard Pearl was I would call him the conductor, the major domo, the hub of the wheel of influential neoconservatives, particularly in Washington. He was based in the American Enterprise Institute.
Of course.
And a lot of this thinking was based on a man named Ahmed Chalabi, who was born in Iraq from a very elite and influential family, a banker. And as the years went by, Chalabi gained tremendous influence and followers in Washington, D.C., including Cheney. And Chalabi he created an organization called the INC, the Iraqi National Congress, which the CIA funded to start insurgencies in the late 90s. He was extremely influential, extremely charming, and he charmed, I hate to use the expression, but he charged the pants off of Judy Miller. He would bring so-called defectors who would tell Pearl and Wolfowitz and Cheney.
My country yearns for freedom.
Well, he would tell Wolfowitz that Cheney didn't care about whether it yearned for freedom. He wanted Iraq. And he wanted to use Iraq as a demonstration of American power, because after all, if the United States could go to Iraq, eliminate the regime, not claim the oil, but assert control essentially over the oil, that would be a lesson to the entire world. And it would vindicate what Wolfowitz had been ordered to prepare in the defense planning guidance back in 1993. It would intimidate any possible rival power, because just look how powerful we are. Chalabi became, as I say, extremely influential through Richard Pearl. And Pearl was very close to Cheney.
How important do you think it was for selling this story to have a Judith Miller type at the paper of record who was buying and regurgitating this stuff? How much does that matter to getting the American public in Washington, maybe more importantly, on board for this?
It's an important point. If you're going to, she would be an important person to bring to your side if you're conducting a propaganda campaign whose ultimate aim is to involve the United States in an invasion of Iraq and the transformation of the entire Middle East, where Judy Miller had a lot of experience. I don't really know if you want to talk about journalism, and you want to go back really far, but if you take someone like Walter Lippmann, who was probably the most influential newspaper person of certainly mid-20th century United States, counseling all the presidents of that period and so on. He at one time was a leftist, and he wrote an article, a very long article, really a study for the New Republic way back in 1920 called A Test of the News, in which the basic research question is, why is it that the New York Times, America's premier newspaper, news gathering, news analysis newspaper of the time. Why is it that they either reported that or predicted that the fall of the Bolshevik regime had either taken place or would take place in the next few days 99 times in a year's period? How did that happen? And his conclusion and his co-author's conclusion was that journalism as practiced in the United States in the mass media is really what you read in the newspaper is a reflection of the hopes and fears of the reporters and the editors who produce the paper. And I don't believe that's changed in a fundamental sort of way. And, Judy Miller, I think, wanted to believe sincerely in getting rid of Saddam Hussein and believing that, democracy would happen and troops would be greeted with candy. And she just swallowed Chalabi hook, line, and sinker. And it's just like during the Russian Revolution, the New York Times followed what these white Russians and expats and people who could speak English, believed.
That's so fascinating, because that is the exact dynamic. Name a foreign conflict or an adversary. There's a whole cottage industry. I'm thinking of one researcher in particular who's been predicting China's imminent collapse every year since 2012.
The same thing happened in Iran in 1978, 1979, when the revolution took place. They had no idea that the Shah was in such terrible shape. Just no idea, because they couldn't even conceive of it. Because like the Shah and his people, they were like us. And how could it be that the masses of Iranians would turn against people who were making Tehran look like Los Angeles?
There's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources, but it's now public that, in fact, he has been seeking to acquire, and we have been able to intercept and prevent him from acquiring through this particular channel, the kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge. And the centrifuge is required to take low-grade uranium and enhance it into highly enriched uranium, which is what you have to have in order to build a bomb.
Obviously Dick Cheney and the rest of this cohort, their incentive structures are different, right? One, we've got to make Israel kind of a prime, give it its own kind of primacy in the Middle East. One is like purely motivated by American primacy. Sure, they come together for this very important project, which is kind of go to war with Iraq because we need to destabilize them, to destabilize Syria, to give Israeli power, blah, 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 blah. There's all these competing things.
I think it's called the Project for the New American Century.
The Project for the New American Century.
Yeah.
And I guess, sure. So they're motivated by these very different desires, and yet their actions turn out to be the same. In your view, what should we be remembering Dick Cheney, not the neoconservative, for? What is, if you could summarize his legacy, how would you summarize it?
On the foreign policy side, it would be primacy.
Yeah.
Unquestioned primacy, unilateralism, and military intervention, building the military, and being able to demonstrate to the world, which is, I think, was his sense of the invasion of Iraq, to demonstrate to the world that the United States military could go anywhere, anytime, and dominate. And on the more, let's say, governance side, which we haven't talked about, is the importance of the unitary executive, because it's particularly pertinent at this time. He believed that the post-Watergate reforms that were designed to curb the imperial presidency and enhance the power of Congress to control the imperial presidency, whether on the in domestic affairs or foreign affairs, was a disaster for America as he conceived it. And everything he did that will be remembered for was designed to reassert the power of the executive in foreign policy making and in domestic affairs.
I mean, is it fair to say that on that battle, he has won so far this century, that the presidency is what he made it?
I mean, there were, FDR had a big influence. LBJ had a big influence. Nixon had some influence. But yeah, I mean, as you look back from now, you just have to say, well, he in that respect, he accomplished an enormous amount.
I mean, well, Trump's on the Venezuela front. I don't remember exactly who said it, if it was Trump or Hegseth or whoever. On bombing Venezuela, he said, I don't really care what Congress has to say. I'm going to do it anyways. And that seems to have been paved the way by Cheney.
I could certainly make an argument along those lines. Yes. Yeah. I think
to say nothing.
I think that was his motivation. I mean, when you asked about, well, what's his motivation? His motivation was power. And it's much easier to exert power if you don't have to consult too many people, especially like 535 members of Congress and stuff like that. And that's what he did. I mean, we haven't talked about it, but, in the 80s, it was Iran-Contra.
Right.
And he was a very influential member of Congress at the time. And he totally defended what Reagan did. And he persuaded George H.W. Bush to pardon those people who were being prosecuted and ultimately convicted in some cases of crimes related to the Iran-Contra affair, because he was their major defender. He was the most outspoken and the most public about saying the president had the right to do what he did, in spite of, what was the Boland Amendment, which said you can't provide any kind of aid to the Contras at the time. That was Dick Cheney in the 80s.
Well, and I feel like there's a direct line between, doing anything in the name of what's in America's interest when it comes to Iran-Contra, and then overseeing a regime of torture during the war on terror and the Iraq War, because the ends justify the means, right?
Yeah, and there's a famous book by Ron Suskind, called The 1%. I can't remember, the 1% something. That at one time Cheney in an interview said, if there's even 1% chance that the United States might be attacked in a nuclear war, we are totally justified in doing whatever we have to do to prevent that. And that book became very famous because it was the 1%. Chance.
I think one thing that sticks to me that is always so shocking is that Dick Cheney did these awful things. He wiretapped Americans. He tortured people extrajudiciously. He brought us into a devastating war that took thousands of Americans, not to mention millions of Middle Eastern lives. And yet, he is the pinnacle of American foreign policy and the American foreign policy elite, or he was the pinnacle of the American foreign policy elite for decades upon decades. Obviously, that came to a head in the Bush years, Bush 2. But he remains this kind of figurehead of American power. And I worry, right? And I continue to worry. I do think there's been a change, but I worry about a country that treats people like Dick Cheney, whose actions fundamentally disagree with his words, as this kind of figurehead of American foreign policy. And I guess I just don't know. Do you think that the Dick Cheneys of the world will remain in power? How do you think, could there be another Dick Cheney, or is he truly in the ground? We can move on.
No, I think it's clear that his influence, lingers. I don't necessarily think that it's dominant. I mean, you could say that Trump, would like to have the kind of power that Cheney aspired to, but there's some indications that he thinks there may be limits to American power. I mean, we don't know yet because he will change his mind many, many times about, whether he's going to save the Christians of Nigeria or whether he's going to, I don't know, do regime change in Venezuela. I mean, yeah. But, I mean, Cheney considered himself a great patriot and believed that that it was his duty to pursue American interests as he defined them. I wouldn't define them in the same way that he would or did, but and he believed that he wouldn't say might makes right, because I don't think he was all that concerned with what was right necessarily, but he he was serving the American interests as he conceived them,
And the conception here being that the American interests are is being conceived by the world as a mighty power that will thwart you if you go against whatever our stated interest is in the moment.
Not just thwart you, it'll even prevent you from challenging them.
So, Jim, we ask all of our guests one question, which is, what do you think, or what do you think motivates America's unending quest to remain at war? Why is America always at war?
I think American exceptionalism is a real problem. When the United States was expanding, and then the Spanish-American War in the 1890s, essentially there were two interpretations of American exceptionalism and America's moral example. And the anti-imperialist, school, which included like Mark Twain and all kinds of other very interesting people, claimed that America's exceptionalism was in improving itself and focusing on becoming a more perfect union and not going overseas, to conquer monsters, like what John Quincy Adams said. And the other school which prevailed was the imperialist school, led by people like Theodore Roosevelt, who said we have a moral obligation to spread democracy and around the world, if by force, if necessary. And I think just even the question of exceptionalism creates a lot of problems. But it dates back to the Puritans, that they believed they were morally superior, and that gives us certain responsibilities. How those responsibilities are to be exercised is a source of debate. But since the 1890s, it's been on one side only, and that's been toward primacy, essentially.
Jim, you win the award for bringing us furthest back in history for that answer, going to the Puritans. But that rings true to me, for sure.
Tyranny in Iraq was worth defeating. Democracy in Iraq is worth defending. All Americans can be certain we intend to complete the mission so that another generation of Americans doesn't have to come back here and do it again.
Thank you so much, Jim Lobe, for joining us. We learned so much from you today. Jim, where can people find you? What are you working on? Do you have anything to plug?
No.
I'll step in and say, check out Jim's work on Responsible Statecraft.
Yeah, Jim is an amazing writer. He is all over Responsible Statecraft. Find his work there. If he won't plug himself, I will. Scholar extraordinaire. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jim.
Sure.
What the hell is... Ooh, y'all are really testing me on some stuff that I hate to say it. I hope I don't sound ridiculous. I don't know who this man is. I mean, he could be walking down the street. I wouldn't know a thing. Sorry to this man.
All right, folks, thanks for tuning in. If you're listening to this on a podcast platform, please make sure to leave a rating and a review of the show. Really helps folks discover it. If you're just listening, consider tuning into an episode on YouTube where there's you can see our smiling faces, and there are all sorts of fun visuals and other elements we try and add to the show to make it extra special. If you are watching on YouTube already, please do subscribe to the Quincy Institute's channel, but more importantly, like, leave some comments for us. We're going to open the show up to a mailbag to get some listener feedback and answer questions soon enough. So we'd love to hear from you, both about anything you liked in particular, anything you want us to go deeper on, stuff that we've missed, stuff we've gotten wrong, questions you want us to pass on to any of the various experts that we work with. We're happy to hear from you guys. So leave it below in the YouTube comments. Otherwise, I mean, if you want to learn more about the work the Quincy Institute is doing to restrain U.S. foreign policy, check out quincyinst.org. Also follow along at quincyinst all across social media. Doing a lot of work to try and move the conversation in Washington when it comes to America's role in the world. And so always happy to have you engaging in support of the Quincy Institute, who makes the show possible. So that's it. Thanks again for tuning in. Peace.
Peace.